This is Jed Disler, and welcome to the Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. We're going to be talking about Annie Fischer today, the Hungarian pianist who lived from 1914 until 1995. She was really a pianist's pianist, or maybe it's more accurate to say that she was an interpreter's interpreter. I think what made her so special was that she understood the classical style and the need for balance and proportion, yet there also was a volatile and temperamental side underneath her surface, and you'd have these explosions from out of nowhere, yet they never seemed to be done for effect or shock value. It was like a volcano bubbling up inside of this pianist, waiting to erupt, yet it would only cool down right away in the performance. And she gave the impression of living in the present, that her interpretations were being conjured up on the spot, yet they nevertheless were informed by a great deal of consideration and planning in terms of detail. I only heard Annie Fischer once live in concert, and it was a recital that she gave in New York at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I think it was in 1988. I'm not a zillion percent sure. Anyway, I remember I was able to get a ticket, and the first half was all Beethoven, and she seemed kind of off form and kind of disengaged, and I felt tempted to leave after the first half, but something compelled me to stay, and I'm so glad that I did, because on the second half, Annie Fischer gave a performance of the Brahms Piano Sonata No. 3 that had all of the quintessential qualities that Annie Fischer displayed in her prime performing years. There was real intense abandon, it seemed, and risk-taking for sure. Yet there was the utmost tenderness in phrasing when it was required, and her sound just seemed to open up by many degrees in this second half where she played the Brahms, and it just seemed to me that her sonority was enveloping the entire venue. I can say that probably was one of the most 3 or 4 memorable live performances I had ever heard of the Brahms F minor sonata, including several from Claudio Arrau, and I think also I heard Yefim Bronfman play it beautifully at the Lucerne Festival. I also heard Jerome Rose rise to the top of his form and play the bejesus out of this piece back in 2011. But getting back to Annie Fischer, the recordings that she made for the EMI label in the late 1950s and early 1960s helped to solidify her international reputation, and they were all collected into an 8-CD set, issued first by EMI and then reprinted under the Warner Classics logo in that label's Icon box set reissue series. It's no longer in print, unfortunately, but secondhand copies do turn up. And because this is a really significant body of work from a major pianist, I think that this is a box set really worth talking about on this podcast. And besides, you can access all of the material through downloading and streaming platforms at the very least. There are so many wonderful things in this collection, including 6 Mozart concertos, and I especially like Annie Fischer's treatment of the Concerto No. 27 in B-flat, Koelschel 595, where she gives the rondo finale a relatively brisk and boisterous treatment that contrasts to the way that way too many pianists these days treat the music with kid gloves and really undermine Mozart's allegro marking. And the Philharmonia Orchestra's woodwinds are on really perky form in this concerto under Ephraim Kurtz's direction. Annie Fischer's recordings of the 21st and 22nd Mozart concertos with Wolfgang Sawallisch and the Philharmonia are justly famous, and I think her sensitive and responsive pianism in these performances is just a total joy. And in the C major, Crucial 467, by the way, she plays Busoni's big cadenza, which is an interesting choice. And incidentally, you hear this cadenza in this marvelous live broadcast recording with Walter Gieseking and Guido Cantelli conducting the New York Philharmonic. That's been reissued several times, and you can find that online. There are some Beethoven sonatas in this set, too, and here, Annie Fischer is on ever so slightly fresher form than in her later studio recordings that she did for Hungarian. Those recordings were all edited together after her death. But in the EMI recordings, we have a terrific E-flat major sonata, Opus 31, number 3. There is one of the most involving and intense renditions of the Opus 111, the final sonata, and especially in the concentration and the tension that Annie Fischer brings to the introduction of the first movement. I picked Annie Fischer's EMI recording of the Beethoven Moonlight Sonata as my primary recommendation a few years ago when I wrote a gramophone collection piece about the Moonlight on record. The Little F-sharp Major Sonata, Opus 78, Annie Fischer does very well on EMI, and I have often written about her EMI recording of the Opus 109, the Sonata number 30, and I very often mention that she was one of the few pianists in the Prestissimo movement to accurately observe the composer's alternating detached and legato phrasings. A lot of pianists just play them all the same way, but she really differentiates them, and it really does make a difference when you're listening. The other pianists who I know do that on record are Charles Rosen and, surprisingly perhaps, Freddie Kempf in his recording on Bis. In the Waldstein Sonata, Annie Fischer's outer movements maybe fall a little short of those by her contemporaneous competitors like Rudolf Serkin and Solomon and Yves Knott, but the way that she sustains the introduction into the finale is so haunting and so gorgeously introspective. It's worth the whole price of the box set, well, at least the price of this performance of the Waldstein. When I reviewed this box for ClassicsToday.com, I talked about Annie Fischer's flexible, poetic, and technically impressive Schubert B-flat Sonata D960, which I think is one of the great versions in the catalog, even though it doesn't have the first movement repeat that became fashionable and politically correct. And, you know, it's an extraordinary repeat because you have that first ending with the sudden interruption and those two-note phrases, and then the trill in the left hand is loud for the first time. Annie Fischer plays the A-flat impromptu, the Deutsch 935 number 2, in a very expansive and reposeful way that I think is really lovely in the outer sections. But then the volatility comes up in the central minor key episode. And she plays the fourth impromptu in this set wonderfully, and she combines some of Rudolf Serkin's metrical rigor and absolute technical honesty with Arthur Schnabel's strong emphasis of the syncopated accents. It's a marvelous performance. There's also some excellent Schumann in this collection, and aside from some slight rushing and a few snatched at chord leaps in the second movement of the C major fantasy, Annie Fischer's performance breathes and sings and really communicates. I really like this a lot. Her Kindersehnen is wonderful too, and her studio recording of Schumann's Carnival, I think, is more accurate than in various broadcast and concert versions that we have on disc, but it isn't quite as characterful and spontaneous. Her Chrysleriana is fabulous, except for the final movement where her basic tempo, I think, is just way, way too fast. There are two concerto recordings which I think are rather duds, unfortunately, because Otto Klemperer's stodgy and unyielding orchestral support really prevents the Schumann A minor and the Liszt E flat major concertos from taking wing. I think here Annie Fischer definitely would have benefited from a different conductor. And that's not to put down Klemperer, because he is one of my favorite conductors, and there are many examples of him being a fantastic accompanist, but just not in these two performances. But the Annie Fischer Bartók Third Concerto in this set, with Igor Markevich conducting, is an absolute classic. And Fischer's phrasing constantly brings out the speech-like patterns and accentuations of Bartók's melodic thinking, even in the finale scampering unison lines. And Markevich, of course, no detail escapes him. He was one of the greatest conductors on record. So this is a collection that's well worth seeking out, or at least trying to source the individual performances from various online sources. I've recently been purging a lot of CDs from my collection that have been sitting around for years, ignored and unplayed and even unopened. But you can bet the farm that I am holding on to my copy of the Annie Fischer Icon box on EMI or on Warner for dear life. This is Jed Disler, and you've been listening to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I do look forward to being with you for our next episode.